Hey everyone, welcome back. I know it's been a while. Now, today we're talking about Xenoblade Chronicles. I have to be totally honest with you, I avoided this game for a long time because of just how massive and overwhelming it seemed to pick up. And that is as someone who loved Xenogears as a young teenager, despite the complex themes that probably went right over my head, and the long drawn out cutscenes, especially in the latter half of the game. And I also enjoyed the first Xenosaga game, but the cinematic side of the game, again, was really overwhelming and just kind of stopped me. The pacing of the game stopped me from being able to finish it. Overwhelming is honestly a great word to sum up how I think a lot of people could feel with just about any Xeno game and maybe the series as a whole, because they all have a certain amount of ambition in excess that could probably be trimmed down to tighten the experience. But this success is also kind of what leads to some of the more amazing aspects of each game and what separates the Xeno games from just about any RPG on the planet, and I think what makes a lot of people love it. I was prompted to make this video because of that excess that we've been talking about, and because Xenoblade finally clicked with me in a way that made me want to potentially unlock that same experience for another intrepid player who also felt overwhelmed by those very same excesses. Now, make no mistake, Xenoblade Chronicles is an absolute masterpiece, despite making many small mistakes. I don't even want to call them mistakes. I would say that honestly, they're really ambitious game design choices that can sometimes get in the way of a lot of players' potential enjoyment. So this is a game that may or may not be right for you. Hopefully this video can help guide new players into maybe picking up the game and offer veterans more appreciation of one of the all-time great RPGs.
You have no hope of victory or escape.
I want to start with a story because it's so integral to every Xeno game. Xenogears and Xenosaga both hit players with a lot of religious and philosophical themes that made the games really deep and probably more interesting than the average RPG plot of like saving the world with, heroes and so on, blah, blah, blah. But honestly, it also ended up in sometimes becoming a convoluted mess, as if someone was kind of trying to connect the dots with the history of the world and the world's greatest philosophers to find a single truth, except with mechs and trips to outer space. Xenoblade Chronicles, on the other hand, is surprisingly much more digestible. I mean, yeah, it starts off with a premise of two continents, if we can even call them continents. They're like floating masses that are both corpses of two ancient gods who fought one another, which means you are literally traversing and running around the carcasses, the arms, the legs, the swords of these two dead gods. That said, the story is pretty easy to understand, at least until later in the game when stuff becomes a bit too Xeno, sometimes for its own good. There are mechs threatening your world, which is called the Bionis, that come from the other continent, and you have a sword somehow imbued with special powers that can damage these mechs and allow you to see potentialities in the future. You take off on a journey to save a female friend who is taken away or possibly eaten by these mechs, and the adventure begins. Pretty simple, right? And there are cutscenes, but they're generally capped off at just a few minutes, whereas Xenosaga sometimes literally had you watching the game for what would be the duration of an entire full-length TV show with save points in the middle. And Xenogears wasn't much better than that at certain points in the game. Now with Xenoblade, the cutscenes do get longer later in the game, and the story definitely becomes a little bit more long-winded. But I never found myself groaning over more story or feeling like I was getting really bored with too many cutscenes or that there were too many ideas being floated at once and that it was becoming too ambitious. This story is really anchored by a world that is vast, beautiful, and really the highlight of the game. And also a modest cast of characters who don't tend to hog the spotlight. None of these characters, in my opinion anyway, would be all-time favorites, and I felt like characters like Charlotte and Ricky had very little development. But, and this is a big but, at the same time, the narrative and focus on the lore in the world get to take center stage for most of the game, and there is some very interesting character growth with some characters, like Ryan, struggling to find his place as the simple muscle that protects an increasingly powerful Shulk who may or may not need him, or Dunban's struggle to find his sister and interpret the world, or Shulk, who ends up kind of simply wanting to save his sister to find he's someone who has a vast amount of control over kind of the future of the continent. And so I do feel like there's enough emotional depth to make the players feel attached enough to the main cast, even if they don't overshadow the story, which was overall more interesting to me. Next is exploration. As a kid, I remember just being so mesmerized by RPGs in that sense of exploration. My first big RPG was Final Fantasy VIII, which I know a lot of people just don't really like, but hear me out for a second. Which almost immediately allowed me to explore a giant university, known as a garden, and an overworld map with another town and a dungeon and some forest and stuff. The more RPGs I played though, the more restrictions I kept seeing. Areas with checkpoints and load times, areas with artificial boundaries that made them feel like very limited sandboxes, and the lack of contingency between areas of the world. This didn't necessarily make these games bad, but a lot of RPGs have lost that deep sense of exploration and openness that the original RPGs set out to achieve. This doesn't mean that everything has to be open world, I want to make that completely clear, but the world should feel fluid, worth exploring, and magical with novel sights, items, quests, characters, and stuff to find. Back to Xenoblade. This is the absolute selling point of Xenoblade Chronicles to me. Now, this game technically does have individual areas, but they are so massive that I never minded even having a constant waypoint to guide me to the next objective. Almost every area in Xenoblade Chronicles is breathtaking and magical, whether it be the giant multi-watered fall basin in Makra Forest or the amazing night sky on the Bionis' leg, or even just every single village in the game which really felt unique and alive. Every area features day and night cycles with different enemies coming out, quests galore, we'll get back to that soon, stunning geographical features, and tons of landmarks to find, which also give you experience, which is a reward for exploration, which I love. Another aspect that I should actually quickly mention is that you can fast travel to any landmark you find, which was a genius idea considering how big this world is. I absolutely loved each area and was always just literally blown away at how imaginative and ambitious the developers were. You are meant to explore an area over the course of the game, returning multiple times to take on new quests and fight special enemies while discovering new areas of that area, sub-areas of the main area. Yeah, that's it. Not everything is perfect though. I really couldn't help, I just wanted a little bit more freedom than I had in terms of the controls. You can jump in the game and you can jump on some obstacles, but I came across this path I wanted to get to with what looked like I could jump on these mushrooms to get up to it, but you just can't. And I felt like there was a little bit, I guess I can't really fault the game for this, but I felt like I wanted kind of maybe a little bit more of a Zelda Breath of the Wild take on exploring the world. Despite these limitations in how you explore, and some of the uninspired quests, which I will get to later, I never regretted exploring because of just how much there was to find. The combat is one aspect of the game that really kept me from playing it for a long time. It looked very, very MMORPG to me, a type of game I have never really been able to back, personally. Not saying you shouldn't play them, just they're not for me. The auto attack feature and waiting for arts just seemed really boring on paper, and to be honest, it actually kind of was at the beginning of the game. The combat in this game is definitely what I would say is a grower, and I'm not going to pretend like it never gets repetitive or it's my favorite combat system ever made, but there's a lot of systems at play that make it really interesting to those who are willing to give the game a fair shake, such as combining different types of attacks to stagger enemies, building up your meter for combos and reviving characters, and piecing together how to take on large groups of foes, since you can actually lure single enemies out or run away from enemies to recover your health and then go right back at other enemies in that group. What made the combat really interesting to me was just how unique every character is, and how they all seem useful at different times. And Shulk is great for offense, fighting mechs, and modest healing. Dunban, on the other hand, can lower aggro, and he has good physical attacks. Charla's the best healer in the game, and has ranged attacks. Ricky has buffs and debuffs galore, while Ryan is kind of your traditional tank. I just loved mixing and matching characters together to see what combinations worked against specific enemies, and really this works for a couple of reasons that I should cover here. One is that you just don't need to buy equipment in this game. You can, but you just really don't need to. Buying equipment is almost always a waste of your money. You should spend your money on the scrolls that teach you new arts, because you always find new weapons and armor from enemies that you kill. They drop them constantly, so you can always kind of like keep fighting enemies and looking to see what equipment you picked up. And this really beat that kind of feeling of like the classic JRPG experience where you go to a new town, just spend all your money on the newest equipment, and it's super cookie cutter. The second reason combat is really cool here is game overs are not that costly. I died many times in this game, sometimes almost knowingly, just to experiment with a team. Dying just leads to being sent back to the last checkpoint, no loss of stats, no loss of level ups, so it just gives you a chance to explore and take on risks without feeling like you're going to lose everything. When you combine the character combinations, the staggering amount of ways to upgrade them, and the lack of penalizations for game overs, the combat becomes a really, really rhythmic dance that's almost as interesting as the exploration or the story. Another aspect of this game that's going to be such a pro or a con for players is the questing. Xenoblade Chronicles 1 commits one major foul, in my opinion, and it is the excessive, and I cannot understate the word excessive, amount of quests and systems in this game. First, there's so many quests. Almost every NPC has quests they can grant you, and they're almost always just simple little fetch quests where you need to go kill a monster somewhere or find an item on the ground to collect. Not very interesting. Very few quests lead to interesting revelations or develop your characters or the world. It's pretty much like the developers just had this like giant tome they were reading and they knew these NPCs inside and out and just like forgot to share why the player should care about all these NPCs. Making matters worse, I mean literally they almost all have quests and you can actually unlock new quests from those same NPCs. It's just crazy. And that's as you gain more affinity with the place and the NPCs, which are just two different systems that I don't really have time to cover in this video, but yes, you can build your affinity up with your playable characters, some of the NPCs, and even friggin' towns. I enjoy doing quests to explore and level up, but they are really tedious, and by the end of the game I was just getting a little bit sick of doing them, and really overwhelming. That's how I felt. It's a word that can certainly pepper a lot of the questing experience. That said, this game does give you some pretty good tutorials on how to understand a lot of the complex systems, but there are some systems that just seem like really unnecessary. Like it was literally 40 plus hours before I even knew that I could actually level up affinity with actual towns, which I guess unlocks new quests, but I had no idea how to do it. And it's just these little bits of excess that add up and leave you wondering whether or not you need to like continue to go diving into a Google search, or you should just kind of keep playing the main quest and skip this side system. And I don't know. It really depends. The last thing I want to talk about is the aesthetics, because for me, that's really what sealed the deal. While I absolutely love the exploration, the characters, and the story, and the combat began to satisfy me after I was like 20 to 25 hours into the game, what really got me was the utterly beautiful world. Not only is it incredibly fascinating to be walking on the corpses of dead gods, but every area is breathtaking, with weather effects, day and night, moving elements such as shimmering ether or fog or twinkling stars. I mean, not even the weaker hardware of the Wii or the Switch can make this world less stunning. And that is a serious compliment to the developers. The other aesthetic that made it beautiful was actually the soundtrack, which is just as varied as the world. Almost every song was catchy and surreal, whether it be the piano ballads that took me through the plains of the lower Bionis, or the guitar solos and synths that got me through tough battles. The music is incredibly composed, incredibly evocative, and really deserves to be mentioned in the greatest JRPG soundtracks of all time. So what are my final thoughts? Well, Xenoblade Chronicles isn't for the faint of heart. Let's get that out of the way right now. But it's also more accessible than just about any other Xeno game ever made in a lot of respects. Features like fast travel, having a constant waypoint to keep you on track, and game overs that don't destroy your progress really smooth out a lot of the excess that does admittedly exist in Xenoblade Chronicles. That said, it is a long game, a big game, a complex game, and players who immerse themselves will definitely enjoy it the most. I had to Google search a number of the game's mechanics and systems to better understand them, and did enjoy the game all the more for doing it, and I don't want to pretend like, just trying to figure out the game by yourself with limited tutorials is necessarily going to be the best way to go about it. but you certainly can play that way and get that base experience. Xenoblade 1 will definitely not click with everyone, but it's so incredibly rare to see an RPG with this much ambition and this much excess tapered with incredibly smart design choices and such a wild sense of exploration and world building that it really is worth the ride if you like RPGs. And even if you don't fully understand every system or even wish to do a lot of the side content, it's okay, you can still really enjoy the main experience. My final thought is that this is the work of a development team with not only incredible talent, but a vision to reach the stars and give players one of the deepest, most novel experiences in gaming history. And by golly, they pretty much succeeded. Alright guys, that's my question to you. First, have you played this game? Do you think it's one of the greatest RPGs of all time, or do you think it's a little bit overrated? And what did you love about it, or what did you not like about it? Catch you next time. Game on.